Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show. We're very glad to welcome to the show Dr. Austin Kocher, who is a geographer and assistant professor at the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, or TRAC, a research institute at Syracuse University that uses Freedom of Information Act requests to study the U.S. immigration enforcement apparatus. He also has a faculty appointment in Syracuse University's Department of Geography, an affiliated expert at the Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship, and he's a research fellow at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University. Dr. Kocher, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So I'd like to start with TRAC, the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, a comprehensive website with in-depth stats on federal enforcement, staffing, and spending, anywhere from the IRS and FBI to immigration. And while I do recommend that folks check out all the categories, like I found it interesting, if not that surprising, that the FBI investigations into white-collar and corporate crimes are at an all-time low. Today we're going to focus on immigration. And there truly is like a book or an encyclopedia book series worth of information and stats to dig into. But on a more zoomed out level to start with, Dr. Kocher, as we tend to cover censored issues here on this show, why is a place like TRAC necessary when the information that you gather is supposedly public record?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's part of what animated the founding of TRAC more than 35 years ago. Dr. Sue Long and New York Times journalist David Burnham were really interested in trying to understand and uncover information about different federal agencies that, getting records that should be in the public domain but aren't yet. One of the unique things that we do, unlike a lot of other institutes or journalists or researchers that use Freedom of Information Act requests to get records, we go after digital records. So we don't go after really paper records. So what that means for us is, most people probably understand that there's been a massive shift in how government institutions are run over the past 20 to 30 years. And most of the information that, when the Freedom of Information Act was written back in the 60s and 70s, government records meant paper records. Well, today, all this data is stored in databases. And unlike paper records, databases are really complicated, and to write good FOIA requests and to get these records and understand them requires sort of an added level of expertise, understanding how government data systems work and how to get the information and then do something with it. So that's where we really specialize. And one of the interesting things that I love getting to do in this work is that even though the records are public records, the process for getting them and making sense of them is so much more complicated. So they should be public, but in fact, one of the things I like to bring to people's attention is, in fact, these days, it's not just about making the records publicly available. In fact, most of the public is overwhelmed with information. So government agencies are putting out more records and more information. But if you don't know how to understand them and make sense of them and make them legible to people, then all that information on the internet isn't going to make a difference. So we really tried to bridge the gap, not just in terms of getting records, but also helping people to understand what's there, so that they understand how their government works.
Yeah, and I can't help but feel that, as a cynic, that this is done on purpose. And I'm curious to hear what your take is. Why is this information made so obtuse or abstract so that somebody who's not an expert couldn't access it? And could you talk also a little bit about your experience in trying to obtain this? Like it's not as simple as just sending in a simple request.
Absolutely. I mean, the government agencies that we are looking at, in particular immigration enforcement, they don't have any institutional incentive to making this information public, because more public oversight means potentially more accountability. And these are not agencies that are, let's say, enthusiastic about public oversight and accountability. So they don't really have an incentive to doing it, to do it. And what that means for us is oftentimes we send in public records requests and we get a variety of denials and rejections, that we, feel really strongly or know that are unfounded or unsubstantiated. And it's not always because the agency is explicitly trying to hide some secret thing. It's just that there is kind of a culture of untransparency, of trying to hold on to this data and hold on to records at the agency, which means we often you have to go into it sort of being prepared to fight a little bit, whether that means writing FOIA, appeals to the rejections. You can appeal rejections of public records requests. It means sending in a lot of public records requests, and you try to get at records in more than one way, so that you might get a rejection or a denial kind of on one request, but maybe you get something back on a different request. So we never send in just one request for anything. We send in more than one. And then, worst case scenario, which is unfortunately a very common case scenario, is we may have to litigate. We may have to go to court and file a lawsuit in court, which is really intensive and demanding for us. But it's also demanding on the agencies because then they have to send attorneys, and it does cost the taxpayers dollars. And in fact, whether it's the Obama administration, the Trump administration, or the Biden administration, it's not as if a new administration comes in and all of a sudden they are just thrilled to work with the public. There's lawsuits that have been ongoing for administration after administration. We don't see a whole lot of change on that. So it does take a lot of work and effort, but because we've been doing this for a long time and we refuse to give up, and we are very tenacious in our work, we are actually able to get a lot of records. We win a lot of lawsuits.
And very glad we are that there are people like you who are that tenacious and are able to stick to it. I want to shift a little bit here to something that's mentioned on the website. Um, the role of technology in immigration, because I think we still have. I mean, we've moved on from the picture of Ellis Island, but we still have a pretty analog perspective on how immigration works, right? Like people walk up to the border and there's like some kind of interaction there and then whatever happens next. But there really is a like this boost in technology and immigration. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and also how this impacts then the surveillance apparatus that will follow these people wherever they end up going.
Absolutely. It's the biggest change that I've seen personally in the last 2 to 3 years. The Trump administration and Trump himself is known for the build the wall phrase. And one of the interesting and problematic parts of that is not just that we know walls don't really work that well to control migration. It's a nativist nationalist slogan. It's there to sort of amp up a base, amp up a certain kind of political base. But it's also a very simple idea of the border, and so actually a lot of people think of walls as being synonymous with borders in some way. And one of the things that I think the Biden administration has done differently, and I would say more effectively, but I would put effectively in air quotes, is I think the Biden administration understands that walls don't work quite that way. And that actually, much like what's happened in the European Union and other parts of the world, the use of technology can be a much more effective bordering tool, actually, than walls. And what that means is these days, for instance, there's two main smartphone applications that the Department of Homeland Security uses to sort of collect data on and monitor and process migrants. One is called CBP-1. It's an app that asylum seekers use. Actually, the Freudian slip there is very important because one of the ways that I have been theorizing this technology is the way in which the technology turns essentially refugees into users. Facebook user, Twitter user, CBP-1 user. And so it's an app that migrants have to download onto their smartphones and use in order to even try to get asylum in the United States. And it's an app that they can use as far south as Mexico City. So it really extends quite deep into Mexico. And then even once migrants get through that process, they may be put on another smartphone app called SmartLink, which serves as a kind of electronic ankle monitor. You can't see it. It's not on your ankle. It's on your smartphone. But it does serve much the same purpose. And so you can think of that, you can think of these apps as being both outside of the United States, ways of the United States extending and expanding border control deep into Mexico, which the United States has been doing for a long time, but now we're doing it with new technologies. And then also extending and expanding that border technology and that border apparatus deep into the country because migrants are using that SmartLink app, all over the country, not just near the border. So the reason, the takeaway message from all of that is that I think currently the Department of Homeland Security is really seeing that bordering mission that they have of sort of quote unquote controlling the border and regulating migration control as a much more geographically expansive project, not just something that's build the wall, but it's actually like build the network. That's what the Biden administration is doing. And what that means practically is in the short term, some of these technologies have reported mix of benefit, and it's a little bit of stick and a little bit of carrot. And when I interview immigration attorneys and migrants and other people who work in that space, they are struggling with the fact that there are actually some benefits to some of these technologies, but they are also keenly aware that the larger negative, and there are lots of negative consequences, by the way, but the larger negative societal level and political level consequences are massive data collection of migrants. And these data systems, which I described those two apps, at this point, they're not exactly directly linked together and on a migrant smartphone, but they do all feed into common data sets, data systems and databases, which now gives the Department of Homeland Security, I think, a really massively quickly expanding a pool of data and resources to effectuate deportation programs. So I'll just sort of close this, sort of this, and this part of the conversation with sort of what in my mind is both a nightmare scenario, but not that far off, which is if we get another Trump administration, and at this point it's a coin toss, if not maybe even slightly more likely based on the polling that we'll have a second Trump administration. Um, that Trump administration is going to have massive more access to data on migrants because of what the Biden administration has built. And if they wanted to roll out massive deportation programs, raids, sweeps, ICE knocking on people's doors, they could do that, and they could do that quicker and more effectively at scale because of the massive amount of data that the Biden administration has collected. So I think that's a real, we are in for a very interesting and concerning decade when it comes to surveillance of migrants.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I often say that neoliberalism paves the road to fascism. And of course, Obama handed Trump the largest surveillance network that the world has ever seen with regards to the NSA and was like, here. So, yeah, it is very dark, nightmare scenario indeed. And I'm curious with the technological and surveillance aspect, I think there's another side of this that people don't know about or think about, and you discussed this on track as well, ATD programs. Could you talk a little bit about what those are and how this, quote unquote alternative could in fact also be darker in some ways?
Certainly. So the alternative to detention program has been around since 2003. There were these experiments in the 90s to say, okay, we're starting to expand immigrant detention. We're putting, immigrants, migrants into what is not prisons. Technically, they're civil detention facilities. These are not people who are held on criminal charges in any way. It's a very, sort of almost a barely legal kind of system. And one of the options that the in the 90s was proposed was to say, well, we don't really need to keep all these people in detention. What they need is community support, legal support, so that while they're going through their immigration process, they're going to go to their hearings. They're not, they're trying to apply for asylum. They're trying to find a way to stay in the country legally. They're trying to do it the right way. They don't need to be in detention, and we don't need to spend tax dollars doing that. Well, what that turned into during the first Bush administration was effectively creating not a true alternative to detention, where we were taking people out of detention and reducing detention, but actually an expansion of what we in geography called sort of carceral logics of migrant control. So detention never went down; detention's always gone up. But alternatives to detention, as it's called, is basically an electronic monitoring program, somewhat like pretrial and post conviction programs in a criminal legal system, where there's ankle monitors and check-ins with a parole officer. That's kind of a similar model that we use in immigration these days. But again, rather than really serving as an alternative, what it's done is it's massively expanded how many people are monitored on a regular basis by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And that's actually that program that the SmartLink app I was mentioning. That's one of the technologies that is now being used. There's a smartphone app. They still use ankle monitors, which is very old technology that they use. And in fact, they just started rolling out in the last year smartwatches. So now there's like an ankle monitor, but it's a smartwatch. So they wear it on their wrist instead of their ankle. And that, we track these numbers. So we've seen that go from a year ago, they had a pilot program in Denver, Colorado with like 50 people. And the last I checked, there's like 1,500 people now on that smartwatch program. So, in addition to sort of this alternative to detention model being not really an alternative, much more of an expansion of sort of control. By the way, I should just add, there's also part of that is also some people are put on a kind of home restriction. They can't leave their home or they can't leave certain areas. They can't leave their city. They can't leave their state without permission. Obviously, this creates all kinds of problems to see family, just normal things that any of us would do. They have all kinds of additional restrictions. For the smartphone app, this is really concerning. They often get notifications through their smartphone about different immigration things, and many of them report a real increase in psychological distress, not only feeling like, "Oh my gosh, the government is on my smartphone," but also like, "If I don't answer a notification, I'm gonna be deported." That's kinda so it can be pretty terrifying, I think, for people on it, even though if the dilemma was really between should someone be in detention versus not in detention? Any of the attorneys I talk to will tell you, like, whatever we can do, we don't want our clients in detention. But, but because of the harsh consequences of detention, it's sort of like the government kind of sets up something that's really harsh and then says, "Oh, if you don't want that, take this slightly less harsh thing." And then that's the mechanism for forcing people to decide between two things that the government itself has set up. And in my view, we should question both. We shouldn't view it as one or the other, but actually question, why do we have any of these systems in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if somebody has an ankle monitor and they're on house arrest, you wouldn't call them a free person, so they're still under detention. And I'm curious, is this considered with track, are these numbers combined in like an overall detention, or do you split them up and make that distinction?
Yeah, so we on the data that we get that ICE publishes every 2 weeks, we use the distinction that's common in the field of policy research and how ICE classifies this data. So we do track detention numbers in terms of immigrants in detention and ATD numbers separately. There's two reasons for that. One is just from a data science perspective, they represent two quite different populations with different sort of characteristics and different data sources. So to combine them, we'd have to do some work. You'd have to make some assumptions, and it might be confusing for some people. So that's one reason. The other reason is from a practical perspective, we're also sort of tracking trends, and the trends in those two areas, differ in many ways. So we want to be as analytically precise as possible based on the data we have. So we do keep them separate. However, as a researcher and as a geographer, I'm always looking for ways to not just how do we accurately describe trends and make sense of the data, but also how do we theorize this within the understanding that we have, as a in sort of critical social sciences, thinking about the state, capitalism, power, race and racism, all these kinds of questions. And so that's where I really draw on, some of my colleagues like, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a geographer, and others who would sort of theorize some of these things around ideas of racial capitalism. Dominique Moran, who's a really great British geographer, talks a lot about, carceral circuitry, circuits of carceral power, and to actually try to stitch together this idea that it's not alternatives to detention and border control. But actually, what animates all of these things is this notion of controlling bodies, particularly people of color's bodies, in the US sort of project of sort of racialized nation state making and reproducing the state. So it's really a question of how does the state use different kinds of technologies and geographic parts of control and exercise of power to carve out these kind of exceptions for people who quote unquote don't belong, don't deserve, whatever, however you want to think about that in terms of the current policy environment. So that's what I really try to do is I try to help people understand, hey, it's not one or the other. Actually, the logic beneath all of these are really crucial to understand. What that allows us to do then is not just to theorize these better, but actually then to take a next step and say, well, how do you dismantle things like this? How do you challenge it? And one of the ways you do that is you start to recognize that, that immigrant detention is not a problem for brown people or Latinos or Hispanic people. And then the criminal legal system in the United States is about Black and African, right? But it's actually, there's all kinds of overlaps here. And actually, the more that you bring, and by the way, working class white people are also affected by these things. So how do you bring together that, the collapse of the welfare state, the act of dismantling of the welfare state with the rise of border controls and the rise of technology for monitoring, and say, actually, this is a problem that affects lots of us. In fact, I sort of misspoke a second ago. I always add this as a footnote. I said that these technologies are about monitoring migrants, but in fact, that's not totally true. It affects anyone who's in these households, and many of them live with children or spouses or the grandparents or partners that are US citizens as well. And so if you're near, or in those similar spaces, you're effectively wrapped up in that sort of surveillance apparatus. So it does actually affect all of us, which is not to say it affects all of us equally, but it does affect all of us. And it's a question that we all need to be asking ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you stitch things together because that's very much what I like to do as well. And we recently had on the show Christian Sorensen, who has done a lot of work mapping the business of war. And one of the things that he pointed out is that it's not the border industrial complex; it is the military industrial complex at the border. And it is imperialism. I oftentimes say that imperialism is a home game. Like we turn that violence inwards as well, because if you only speak to the world in one language and that's the language of violence, it's ridiculous to assume that you could come home and be Mr. Rogers. Um, and so I really appreciate that you combine those issues. I think that's so important. And with regards to the ATD, I mean, I can't help but wonder, and this might be a question that doesn't have an answer or that you don't know the answer to, but okay, so we have the ATD, which is dark and Orwellian and Black Mirror-esque, but then why are there still kids in cages? Like, why is that still a thing that happens?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's very practically speaking, there's always going to be an aspect of the immigration system, at least under the current model, that where one exercise of carceral power is about detaining and controlling bodies in confined spaces like that. And in fact, it's more helpful to view detention as a pathway to monitoring, right? So it is part of the pipeline. Detention is what, being in detention is, in many cases, that is actually what gets you put on electronic monitoring. And then being on electronic monitoring, once you're in that sort of system, it's just much more likely that you're going to end up back in detention again because you didn't make an appointment, you didn't answer a notification, like whatever the reason might be. So it's definitely a system that relies on rotation. And so in some ways, we could think about electronic monitoring as like, could it exist actually without detention? Like they're just so closely interconnected. But you're right. I mean, and that's one of the easiest things to point out when talking about what this alternative detention model, why is it even there when we still have people in detention, especially kids? And it's because they require each other. They need each other, for the system to work, unfortunately, under this model. Again, we can certainly imagine different models. We didn't always have this model. There was no such thing as immigrant detention like we have it today prior to 1980. It literally, the for-profit prisons that we have today in America the first ones were for immigrants. Then it expanded to other areas, but the first ones were for immigrants. So classic story of immigrants and marginalized people getting something tried out on them first and then expanding to the rest of the population. In fact, I mentioned CBP One is the app that asylum seekers have to download on their phone. Well, the Customs and Border Protection, which oversees that program, has just submitted a request for approval through the normal federal rule change process to expand the use of that app to immigrants who are coming to the United States in other ways, lawfully, not asylum seekers, but other people. And so, you can imagine these technologies again, they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it won't be that long if you're a US citizen that lives in the US Mexico border area or the US Canadian border area. This app is going to be on your smartphone in a couple of years, and you're going to have to do things with it. So that's why we have to pay attention to these things early and often.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, very glad that you made those connections. And I kind of want to circle back
Yeah.
with the time that we have left, because you mentioned, of course, that this network reaches as far south as Mexico City. And it reminds me of this idea that where I actually saw you first was at a book event here in Baltimore at Red Emma's, where you were on a panel discussing John Washington's book, The Case for Open Borders. And in that book, something that it highlights is how borders are so malleable and movable, and yet we think of them as these steadfast, immovable spaces, particularly the southern border. And yet you just pointed out, well, no, the US southern border, at least digitally, extends far into Mexico. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, you mentioned you're a geographer, and I think some people listening might be like, what does that, I mean, that's
Yep.
not like immigration law. Like, where does this connect? Could you talk a little bit more about this area of study, the legal geographies of immigration?
Yeah, absolutely. And, for geographers, what we're really interested in, what I'm interested in as a political and legal geographer, is this connection between space and power and the state, mostly applied to immigration, although I'm also done some work around policing and other questions. And, for geographers, what the reason that we're interested in space is sort of twofold. From like a big picture perspective, we can't imagine human existence outside of some sort of spatial, you know, aspect. We create we create some kind of home for ourselves that's a part of placemaking. Part of placemaking and creating the space that we live in often means we create these sort of ideas about who belongs and who doesn't belong. And so this is something that becomes very much wrapped up in identity. So we think the Jim Crow era was all about creating all of these micro borders and all of these geographic forms of social control to keep Black and white people in the South separated, with that aspect of maintaining racial control and white hegemony, and controlling integration in very careful ways. This is also something so that's a racial example. That also happens with gender, the way that spaces are coded as masculine or feminine or non-binary, or the ways in which heteronormativity plays out, where some spaces are kind of saturated with those kind of masculinist tropes and images and practices. And so one thing that's always a part of our understanding of how power works in society is how space is actually created and controlled. That all of those things are also true on the national level, where one of the most serious and in my view one of the most damaging sort of ideas and sort of evolution in how human society has organized itself is around this nation state system, which is quite young. There most of the world had no such thing as boundaries and borders and nation states that we have today. If you look back at a map 300 years ago, couple little bit of parts of Europe, and that was it. And so this is a model of human organization that has spread really dramatically. And although there's always been different kinds of forms of social division, the nation state model brings with it this, what Weber calls this sort of monopoly on the use of force and power. So now we get armies that are attached to territorial control on the outside, and we get police that are that expression of state power on the inside, and we get borders, which are all about regulating this access to space and access to population. One of the most important things that's happened in, let's say, the last 100 years, and this is where sort of my research comes in, is that we've seen, or let's say the last 50 years, is we've seen with the combination of globalization and the collapse of sort of post World War II, Bretton Woods institutions, and as you said, the growth of neoliberalism, one of the things that has emerged is that borders, although very important, hard physical borders at the edges of nation states, although that's really those are continue to be and are more militarized than ever, most most countries and most people who are sort of the captains of industry recognize that actually we need a different labor geography that a nation state model can't provide. And capital flows of investment and accumulation and dispossession are all phenomena which are cross border. So no, there is no company, there is no such thing as an American company anymore. There isn't a company that doesn't have manufacturing and labor all over the world. And there isn't a company that solely keeps their money located in one country. These are investments and that flow around the world. And so we already know that in many ways borders are a leftover technology. And yet at the same time, what we've seen them militarized. But what we've also seen is these mechanisms of control have also, their geography has changed dramatically to keep up with this. So yeah, the app goes deep into Mexico. We could even ask ourselves, like, why? That's a weird question of like territorial sovereignty. Does the United States have the right, to require? Yeah, so it's kind of a question. But at the same time, the U.S. has been funding, Mexico's southern border enforcement for a long time. FBI and ATF agents regularly work throughout Latin America. One of my colleagues, Matt Coleman at Ohio State University, working with Kendra McSweeney there. Like they're looking at Coast Guard interdictions off the coast of South America. You think of the Coast Guard as going around the United States. They're not. They're getting approval from countries in South America to go and snatch people who might be suspected of drug trafficking on the open seas. So that this I all of the things which sort of gave rise to the nation state and these institutions of power and use of force, they are not concentrated just at the border, but they're expanding, around the world. But if you fly to the United States from most countries in the world, you have to go through a pre-screening. I don't go through a pre-screening when I fly to Germany or when I fly to Mexico. But if you fly to the United States from those places, you're getting pre-screened in France and in Mexico. And so what we've seen is, even though the border remains really crucial as a site of political action and violence, that violence has really just, from a geographic perspective, has just exploded. And so trying to keep up with what's happening and to understand the human rights implications, as well as, what we might do to mitigate the harm, is just a fundamental concern to a lot of political and legal geographers like myself who are trying to reconceptualize what space means in this new era of state violence.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I feel like I could talk to you about this for the next like 10 hours, but that also speaks to so much with regards to the fact that US imperialism, I mean, the US just forces itself onto so many different nations that are supposedly their own sovereign nations. And then, so what does that mean in terms of their sovereignty that we have almost 1,000 military bases around the world? And, where does that border lie? At least for Uncle Sam, he doesn't seem to have any borders. So, but again, unfortunately, we have a limited amount of time, so I guess we have to leave it here for today. Dr. Coker, thank you so much for digging into this topic and contextualizing so much of this. Where's the best place for folks to follow your work?
Sure. So I would say, I really like where this conversation has gone. I appreciate this as well, and I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing with Project Censored. We do really put out a lot of data at trac.syr.edu about the immigration system. It's just, we try to make the data legible. There's a whole bunch of different interactive graphs and tools. So if you're interested in immigration, it's a great resource. I'm also on Twitter at AC Kocher and Substack at Austin Coker. And I, try to stay pretty active. And in addition to the scholarship, I try to write as much online and make it as accessible as I can for folks. Anyone's welcome to reach out on any of those platforms.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us.
Thanks a lot.